we often see some extraordinary stories. It brings to mind characters like cannibal dictators, racists who dislike people of color or born somewhere else, and thieving presidents who flee the country with huge sums of money. But in the history of the African continent, have there not been leaders who sincerely fought for the good of their country? Of course, there were such leaders, and we will tell you about one of them right now. There was a country in West Africa called Upper Volta, and it was a French colony. During the reign of the French, the colony was periodically shaken by rebellions of various sizes, but all of them were unsuccessful. But times change, and after the Second World War, decolonization gradually began. The once powerful empire began to lose one region after another. In late 1959, early 1960, the country became de facto independent. The future first president, a fighter for independence, and just a man who loved his country, Maurice Yameogo, came to power. But one can love one's country in any way, for example, by banning all political parties except one's own. And look, although de jure the country has not yet had time to become independent from French rule, and there is already established a dictatorship. In 1960, Upper Volta declared independence, and Maurice became president of the independent state. But wait, because in the country after that, there will be a series of coups, which will eventually bring the hero of this video to power. Let's get to know him. Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara, aka Thomas Sankara. He was born on December 21st, 1949, in a family in the French gendarme, a veteran of the Second World War. In Upper Volta, as in many African countries, it is very important where you come from and what kind of people you are. Thomas was unlucky because he was a third-class Ilmimosi man. His father was from the Mosi tribal group and his mother from the Fulbe. But thanks to the fact that his father was in good standing with the French authorities, his son was able to go to school and get a decent education for those places. What to become in the future? Our hero had several options, and in elementary school, Tom was a church servant. Parents as well as priests saw in him a future clergyman, but instead he went to the Lyceum wanting to become a doctor. But fate ordered otherwise, and therefore Thomas ended up in the School of Officers' Children, where, by the way, military science was taught by civilian professors. However, after graduation, he continued his studies at the Military Academy of Antsirabe in Madagascar, where everything was already serious. At the academy, he had access to many books, including political ones, among them the works of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. It was during those years that Tom Sankara's revolutionary views took shape. In 1972-1974, there was a border conflict with Mali over a small territory, which was rich in minerals. Tom Sankara had time to make his mark there, but after this experience he disliked war in all its manifestations, and later, when he recalls these events, he will call this episode a senseless bloodshed. The conflict ended in nothing, and the situation remained in the status quo. Successfully advancing in his career, Sankara reached the rank of captain, and in 1976 he became the head of the National Commando Training Center. That same year, Toma was sent to Morocco, where he met fellow officers, and what's more, they shared his Marxist beliefs. One of these people was Blaise Compaoré, with whom our hero became friends, and to such an extent that for the Sankara family, Blaise became like family, and every day had lunch with them. In addition, Tom Sankara was a musician and played the guitar. In the capital of the country, he became famous in the jazz band Tout à Coup Jazz. His favorite means of transportation was a motorcycle, which made him stand out among ordinary people. This is how Captain Sankara's life went until 1980, when another coup took place. Why did it happen? Because the country was in a perpetual crisis. Ordinary people were constantly short of food. The situation was saved only by aid from the UN and the United States. There was no talk of any economic development in principle. and the authorities were busy filling their pockets. Therefore, during the next rallies, Colonel Say Zerbo took power. Thomas Sankara was an active participant in the coup, as was his friend Compaoré, both of whom were members of the new junta that took part in the overthrow of the dictator. At the end of 1981, Sankara was appointed Secretary of State for Information, but he soon moved into open opposition because he disagreed with the new government and the policies it was pursuing. He was not satisfied with the fact that trade unions and opposition were suppressed and the wishes of the people were ignored. So he resigned, making a public statement during a television broadcast. Naturally, he was not the only disgruntled officer. He had many comrades who supported his resignation. This is how an underground military organization called the Group of Communist Officers came into being. Already in 1982, another coup shook Upper Volta. Major Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, a military doctor, deposed Say Zerbo for not doing anything significant, but only trying to stay at the helm. This coup was nothing new to the country, but suddenly, in January 1983, Jean-Baptiste appointed Thomas Sankara as the country's prime minister. But the celebration didn't last long because the French didn't really go anywhere. Yes, they gave independence to the country, but in their economic sphere of interest, Upper Volta remained. Of course, there was no oil or uranium there, but still there were some useful resources: copper, manganese, gold, nickel, titanium. So it was not good to waste. Therefore, France was not satisfied with such a radical character as Tom Sankara, because he is in one of the most important positions in the country, and France didn't want Sankara to hit its pockets. After a visit from the son of the French president, Sankara was removed from his post and put under house arrest, the reason being two radical views. The problem is that by that time Sankara was already known and popular among the people, including for his honesty. Naturally, such a decision caused anger among the poor, the majority of the population, which led to an uprising. However, it was suppressed, but the position of the authorities was not the strongest. After 3 months, the garrison of the capital, led by a dear friend Blaise Compaoré, organized another coup during which Sankara was released from arrest and became president of the National Council of the Revolution. Amusingly, just a few days after Sankara's release, the right-wing officers tried to stage their own coup, but they failed. Thomas Sankara began to lead the country into a bright future. Of course, once in power, being a convinced communist, Sankara began to make anti-colonial and anti-imperialist speeches. And to do so not only in front of the citizens of his country, but also in the UN. The struggle started small, the rejection of the colonial legacy, the name of the country. A year after the revolution, Upper Volta fell into oblivion. Now in its place is Burkina Faso, which can be translated in 3 ways: the homeland of honest people, the country of honorable people, or the country of people with a brave heart. But in addition to decorative updates, there were also reforms aimed at improving life in the country. Mass vaccination of children began. In just 15 days, 2.5 million children were vaccinated against infectious diseases, which halved child mortality, the highest in the world at the time. Cuban doctors who willingly helped the young revolutionary state helped in this. In addition, the emancipation of women began. No more gender-based oppression, and now the fair sex were no longer slaves, in every sense, attached to the hearth. Barbaric customs like female circumcision were banned, polygamy and forced marriages were abolished. Women were equalized with men and were finally able to receive education and serve in the army. Women were encouraged to join the army, which eventually led to the creation of the Women's Guard motorcycle unit. And eventually, women in large numbers became part of the government, which was almost impossible for an African country of those years. Fun fact, on the first anniversary of the revolution, they started having a Solidarity Day. On this day, men did what women usually did: cooking, laundry, cleaning, going to the market where you both trade and buy, etc. This was done so that men could experience what a woman's life was like. And since we are talking about Africa, there is no washing machine, not everyone has gas stoves, and not everyone knows how to use them. And the road to the market may not be close and not the easiest. The fight against many of the diseases that are still plaguing Africa today has also begun. A campaign was launched to eradicate illiteracy in 9 local languages. During the years of Sankara's rule, many wells were dug, which in Africa, is a vital necessity because it is important not only to have water but also that it was clean. The final touch was the spread of contraception in the country and the recognition of the AIDS epidemic, which made Burkina Faso the first country in Africa that considered the threat of this disease extremely dangerous for Africans. Of course, this is not all, because the list of things to do was simply huge. The construction of brick factories and simple dwellings for the population began actively. They began to expand railroads and build new roads to make a unified network. Dams and reservoirs began to be built across the country. But the most important victory is the victory over hunger. First of all, the land issue had to be solved, and for this purpose, the local leaders, a kind of middle class of the country, who sometimes did not know the measure, had to be restrained. Privileges, property, and 99% of the land were taken away from them. The lands were redistributed among the poor. The chiefs had no more power, so they had to work on what land they had left. Some tried to resist, but they were quickly put in their place. And since there were a lot of people and there was enough land for everyone, there was someone to work. This in turn increased food production many times over. In addition, small businesses were subsidized in every possible way. For example, for the first year, the enterprise could not pay rent. In addition, the government was engaged in directing local business not to export to neighboring countries, but to the domestic market. One of the most important things in the fight against hunger and crop yields was also the fight against desertification. You see, the country is on the border with the Sahara, with the Sahel savanna next to it, which is what feeds everyone. But the problem is that the desert is relentless and constantly advancing, sending its sands south on the wind. To win here, it took a pretty radical approach to the issue. Up to 10 million tree seedlings had to be purchased to stop the sands from spreading. As a result, it bore fruit, the desert was defeated, the number of crops increased many times, and this despite the fact that the land was cultivated by ordinary people with hoes and the Industrial Revolution was out of the question. But where was the money for all these improvements coming from? Have you ever heard of the poorest president ever? If not, we're telling you about it right now. Yes, that's right, Thomas Sankara gave up his presidential salary and continued to live on his captain's salary. The money for his presidency he transferred to an orphanage. But he didn't just limit himself, he forced other government officials to live more modestly. Instead of expensive suits, they had to wear cotton tunics made locally. The government's fleet of cars then included Mercedes, and Sankara sold all those Mercedes and bought Renault 5s, small cars, the cheapest in the country. On top of that, officials were no longer allowed to have personal chauffeurs. They were also forbidden to fly first class, with business class allowed for the most important representatives of the country. In general, they saved money wherever they could, but the country did not live by savings alone. It also developed the export of minerals because there was something to sell. And all this and more was done during Thomas Sankara's rule from 1983 to 1987. The country also began to nationalize industry, which was not to everyone's liking. French capital and its interests were far from happy to see Thomas Sankara at the helm. It meant losses, and in the future, it threatened that the rest of the country might take Burkina Faso's example. At first, the French began to make subtle hints that Sankara had better stop playing revolution and keep quiet. But Sankara was firmly convinced that he was right. Well, no one wanted to retreat, so the French intelligence began to dig and look for dissatisfied with the rule of Sankara, and there were some. Naturally, they were tribal leaders who were severely restricted and officials who could no longer afford to live luxuriously. One of those who betrayed him was his dear friend Blaise Compaoré. Why? It is not known exactly. According to some versions, he was promised a lot of money. According to another, French intelligence informed Blaise that Thomas sleeps with his wife, and according to a third, that he was simply afraid of the radicalism of his comrade, and that it would lead to a breakdown in relations with France. Either way, on October 24, 1987, Thomas Sankara and his cronies were killed in a coup, after which their bodies were dismembered and buried in an unmarked grave. Burkina Faso returned under the wing of Paris, and further plans to transform the country into something better were forgotten. Those who tried to resist the coup were killed or arrested. Blaise Compaoré became the country's president that same year and ruled until 2014, when he was deposed, after which the coup trials against Sankara, which are still ongoing, began, and in which he faces life imprisonment. In Burkina Faso, meanwhile, one coup after another continues, and the last one was in 22. Thomas Sankara became a symbol of revolution and Marxism in Africa, a fighter for justice and a better life for one and all. He became known as Africa's Che Guevara, the poorest president and the most honest president. Naturally, he had many plans for the future of his country, but they were not destined to come true. After his death, in the personal estate of Sankara were found an old car, Peugeot, bought before coming to power, a refrigerator with a broken freezer, 3 guitars and 4 bicycles. This is where we say goodbye. See you again, friends.